Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another presentation in the Barts 900 series. Very good to have so many of you join us tonight. And I suppose what we're going to be offering you is in some cases a trip down memory lane. The number of events that we're able to stage in the Great Hall is in fact increasing as the restrictions ease. So that last night, many of us were able to enjoy a live concert by the City Music Foundation. And I know that the publicity, the reciprocal publicity that we're able to work with the CMF means that more and more people will be able to attend those concerts. Really very highly recommended when you get the chance, as you will do during our regular e-shots to you all. Also coming up tomorrow night, a recording, also an event that you'll be able to see in webinar fashion like this one, will be a discussion between Will Paling and Jackie Riding, who was our guest a few months ago, and she is finally launching her much-awaited biography of William Hogarth. So that's tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, and the link to book your place in that, if you haven't already done so, was in the last e-shot that you will have received just a couple of weeks ago. Many of you have been asking about our guest last month, Jack Beaumont, the Great Britain international rower, who's heading off to Tokyo for the Olympics, and his progression up to that point. Well, I'm pleased to tell you that I spoke with Jack only a couple of days ago. He's with the rest of the team in training at altitude in the Austrian Alps as their general custom, build up their red cell mast before the Olympics, and they'll travel out to Japan in about 10 days' time. So obviously we wish him the very best of luck with the rest of the team out there. Okay, time to join my guest, who's Edward Rowland, as I said, the medical director of Barts. Good evening, Ed. Welcome to the Barts 900 series.
Good evening, Robert. Thank you very much indeed for asking me. It's an enormous pleasure, and I think we've got a few trips down memory lane, as you say, this evening, and a little bit about the hospital as it gallops into the 21st century.
Exactly what we're hoping for, because what we're trying to do during the next little while is to do some comparisons of past and present, because of course you started out your life at Barts all those years ago, a year or two before me, I think, as a medical student. So why don't we start at the very beginning? Normally at this stage, I ask our guests to tell us a little bit about themselves and how they got to this point. That is, if you like, the meat of tonight's discussion. So take us through the story. So you arrived at Charterhouse when exactly?
1968, September 1968. Robert, I suspect my days as a medical student are probably best glossed over. I had a great time, I have enormous. It's interesting how St. Bartholomew's has run as a thread through my medical career and also my social career. My mother was the person who persuaded me to come to St. Bartholomew's, and I think was instrumental. But I met my wonderful wife here. I was married in the church. My children were born here. Two of my children were married in St. Bartholomew the Great. And it's very fascinating just to reflect on the threads of St. Bartholomew's, many of which we'll cover today, because I think they do give an insight into where St. Bartholomew's is today. It's been through, in the last 50 years, some interesting times. It has such a wonderful history that we're adding a little bit more to it.
Well, I'm going to drag you screaming and kicking back those 50 odd years, I'm afraid, because I'd like you, don't forget, you see, that within our audience tonight, we have new and old members. So the old members are going to be taking a trip down memory lane, and they're going to be keen to see what has happened, because we've got a very international audience, many of whom will not have visited Barts for many a long year. And then, of course, we've got younger members who are keen to know how things were in our day, back in the olden days. So let's just take a look.
So I think, Robert, the first thing is that the medical school, the medical college, was very much an integral part of the hospital, wasn't it? The two were inextricably linked, as they had been for several hundred years, really. And life at College Hall was for many people was the place they started. There was, in the first couple of years, I think for most of us, a bit of a distance between the what we did as medical students in Charterhouse Square and then the hospital for those first 2 years. But then you started your clinical time, and then you really transferred your life to the society of the hospital. That undoubtedly has changed. We had great times over in College Hall, and the hospital offered an opportunity to integrate yourself with what it was like to be a doctor. That's perhaps one of the things that has changed greatly in the last 50 years. Obviously, the issue of the medical college and its future was something that was very much at the forefront of the hospital's thoughts 50 years ago. And it's interesting to look back at some of the documentation around the 850th celebrations of the hospital, because there was undoubtedly a sense of that things were going to change. As you may remember, the Todd Commission looked at medical student training in London and recommended that 12 medical schools were reduced to just 6. And that was going to be achieved by amalgamation. And the decision was discussed and eventually recommended and accepted that St Bartholomew's Hospital Medical College would amalgamate with the Royal London.
We're jumping the gun again here, Ed, aren't we? Because what I'd like you to do, if I may, is to give us a sense of the community feel, both in Charterhouse and then during the clinical years over the road at the hospital, because we're looking at College Hall. College Hall at least is still standing, although it's now known as Dawson Hall, renamed after Sir Anthony Dawson. Give us a sense of the community feel during those first couple of preclinical years.
I think for many people, it was the first introduction to their medical school life was as a resident in Charterhouse Square. You wouldn't see much difference between that building then and now, but it was a community. Most of us, I think, started our medical school life resident. Then we were thrown out to go and live somewhere else for our second year in most cases. It was an opportunity to meet other students. I think many instances were not really part of the University of London, and perhaps that, looking back, was not a great thing. So we were all medical students today. There's the physiology block, the biochemistry block, the anatomy block behind us, the person taking the photograph. Those buildings are still there, but there are some new buildings nowadays. And then I think the great advantage of going over to the hospital for one's clinical years is that there you learned about the community of the hospital. And that, this must have been taken, I suspect, probably before the Second World War, because my recollection of that was lots of consultants' cars parked in the square. That doesn't happen nowadays, although I'm sure there ought to be a medical director's car parking space somewhere there. I'm very pleased.
I think we all dreamt of that, didn't we?
We all did. I seem to remember that Dr. Graham Hayward, who was I think always regarded as almost the sort of senior physician, had a space woe betide anybody who ever parked in his space. And those trees, of course, were destroyed in 1987 in the Great Storm. And I'm pleased to say that the replacements are almost as tall as those in that picture.
Now, you say, of course, that this must have been before the Second World War, but if that is indeed the case, then it can't have been long before, because the King George V building, the KGB building that we're looking at now, was built to replace the South Block, Gibbs's original design, which was a couple of hundred years old. That was built, I think, in 1935. But as you rightly point out, this aspect of Barts has not changed materially over these last 50 years, although, well, the stonework is a lot cleaner, as we'll see in some later slides.
It is a wonderful space to relax and live in and work in. The patients are still taken out into the square in good weather. It is a huge privilege to be in such beautiful surroundings in the centre of London.
Let's remind ourselves, if we may, of the layout of the hospital as it then was, because it was quite a broad community geographically as well as figuratively. Just remind us of some of these key features of the hospital as it then was.
So around 50 years ago, the medical and surgical wards were in the King George V block, almost aligned as a V shape. And my recollection is that most of the entrance ways of getting into the hospital was past the flower shop and into the middle of the V. It did have a name, which I won't repeat in such delicate company, for that entrance to the hospital. And then the rest of the square was made up of the East Wing, which was predominantly obstetrics and gynecology, and then the West Wing, which was orthopedics. The North Wing was pretty much as it is today, and then the children's, Kenton and Lucas, and then various departments, pathology, the library and the museum, and then outpatients, the huge block that also housed the resident doctor's quarters, which has, of course, completely disappeared. And then on the east side of the hospital was Queen Mary's Nurses' Home, a place that I tried without success to ever enter. As you may recall, it was very heavily guarded. And then outside that footprint, which is Giltspur Street and the square of Smithfield and Little Britain, outside those were the QE2 block, which was built in 1962 and housed for most of its time the cardiac, ENT, neurology services. And then William Harvey House, radiotherapy, and some of the pathology services, remember, all outside. Now, those have all disappeared, and the footprint is essentially that contained within the 3 streets on the map there.
Okay, well, we'll have some pictures of that later on, I have no doubt. Now, our next picture shows Sir Edward Tuckwell about to retire from his position as senior surgeon at Barts. Now, this is his grand round. Now, do tell me, do grand rounds exist anymore? And if they do they look anything like this?
They don't look anything like this. Grand rounds, so we still continue the grand round tradition at St Bartholomew's. We try to make it, so we have audit days 7 times a year, and we have a grand round associated with that. I really was introduced to what I call the proper grand rounds at the Hammersmith Hospital. We had an interesting sort of background because I moved to the Hammersmith actually after my SHO job at St Bartholomew's. And of course, the Royal Postgraduate Medical School was more or less established by Sir Francis Fraser, who was one of the eminent physicians at St Bartholomew's in the 20s and 30s. And he really established really academic medicine in much of the ways in which it's followed today. And my recollection of staff rounds, grand rounds at Hammersmith was this most fantastic opportunity to learn from greats in medicine, and there were often many Nobel Prize winners there who would talk about all different aspects of medicine, and that's a tradition that I would like to think that I've brought back to St Bartholomew's, which is funded on some of the wonderful academics we have here, and getting all the junior and senior staff together. It's a real opportunity for multidisciplinary discussion and interaction.
Great. Well, let's include the nurses in this discussion, because we've got a number of nurses and ex-nurses who are watching tonight. So let's have a look at a view day scene from, I think, 1975. And some of you will be able to name some of these individuals here sitting on the edge of the fountain. I can't help feeling, Ed, that people watching this who are working or training at the hospital today will look at these uniforms and marvel at their uniqueness in the same way that you and I marveled at pictures of Victorian nurses standing in the square in the late 19th century. What do you think?
Times change and progress alters our perspective of these things. There was I am married to a Barts nurse, and I'm forever grateful for that. They were just the most wonderful part of the hospital, and I still look back on those days. Their attention to detail, their attention to care was something I took away from this hospital, and remember with enormous affection. And I've hoped that I've been able to continue that admiration all those years later. They were, in terms of looking after patients, I think they delivered some of the best care I've ever seen. And I'm very pleased to say that that care continues in the hospital today.
Thank you very much. If I should have mentioned at the top of the program, those of you who are used to these webinars will know that you can use the chat button if you want to make a comment, and the comments are already coming in. Elizabeth Wood-Dow has already said she loves the uniforms. Of course, she used to wear one of these back in the day, and she comments that scrubs will never look so good.
They will never look as elegant. I think everybody accepts that. And that anyway, yes, don't get me started on the pink uniform. It was wonderful.
Yep. Well, you say you're married to a Barts nurse, you and me both. So let's move on. But let's have a look at two buildings. Well, there's Queen Mary's that you never broke into, and neither did I, allegedly. Of course, one of the buildings that no longer exists, as indeed, of course, over Little Britain, does Gloucester House.
You certainly wouldn't recognize. You certainly wouldn't recognize Gloucester House nowadays. I think we've got a photograph of how it has been resurrected.
We do indeed in a short while. So let's move on, because of as you pointed out a little earlier. I think I've got one more picture of View Day, and I put this up for you, Ed, because on the left there is Graham Haywood, who was the head of the cardiology department all those years ago, and of course. The cardiology department, when we started, consisted of just two consultants, Graham Haywood and John Hamer, and just two wards on Smithfield and Mary on the second floor of the KGB. And that, at least in purely numerical terms, has altered radically over the years, has it not? It
has. So there are now 58 cardiologists in various guises at St Bartholomew's Hospital. But it illustrates this profound change in medicine over 50 years. So in this day, so Graham Haywood was also physician at the National Heart Hospital, and that's where he delivered his specialist care. There was some cardiology, obviously, up on Smithfield and Mary, but it was mostly general medicine. And that was how we mixed the two in those days. And that, of course, is what has changed. Specialism and subspecialism has developed beyond recognition. And it is one of the things that obviously has changed beyond almost recognition, but I believe it has changed to the benefit of patients. If you think back to the relatively few things we could do in those days, as a cardiologist, you really didn't do very much other than look after people in bed, let them recover from their heart attacks and their other problems, and administer tablets. That world is gone, and the world is very different and arguably an awful lot better as a consequence.
Yeah, one of our contemporaries was remarking only the other day that she had worked on those medical wards, and she can well remember that the majority of the patients on the cardiology wards were suffering from rheumatic heart disease rather than ischemic heart disease, and with the very low prevalence, presumably, of rheumatic fever, it's almost vanished off the face of the earth. Presumably, you very rarely see
in this country. Well, you very rarely see acute rheumatic fever, of course, in this country, but you see the consequences of that nowadays, and patients coming back for procedures. And that is, of course, when you're operating on people who are somewhat older, but have had previous cardiac surgery, then you do need absolute experts who are able to get great experience at valve surgery, for instance. And those are the kind of things that we now specialize in at St. Bartholomew's Hospital.
Let's move on then, because one of the great things that you and I both experienced during our time at Barts was the last anniversary celebration. We're looking ahead to the 900th in 2 years' time, but what are your memories of the 850th, Ed?
Parties, and I remember talking to one of my good friends from those days who I seem to remember went off in a van to the Champagne district and brought back a van load of booze for the 850th. Yes. Anyway, it was great fun, enormous fun. But I come back, I suppose, to the wisdom of those who were leading St. Bartholomew's Hospital at that time. It was a time of great celebration. The history of St. Bartholomew's goes on. We bear that history, and for me, that has been a very important part of reminding all those who work in the hospital the enormous contribution that St. Bartholomew's has made over very many years, the very famous people who have worked here, who've driven healthcare, but a sense of the continuation of what the charter of the hospital. It is to provide healthcare to London, to the City of London, but to the whole of the population that we serve. And I think those traditions have continue, and they've been particularly important in the last 18 months under the great pressure we've been under. But they've also been something that I think has inspired the rebirth of the hospital, which we'll talk about. Because if we talk about what happened in the 850, it was a great time of celebration. But if you read the book, particularly the chapter written by Sir Ronald Bodley Scott about the hospital, there was a sense of uncertainty about the future. As I mentioned, the junction of the medical schools, the reduction in the number of medical schools had been debated and was about to be accepted. And the threat over the hospital's future was obviously thought about at that time. And perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment.
Before we do that, Ed, I should prompt people that the 900th anniversary committee are about to start making decisions on the events that might be held in 2 years' time to celebrate that major event. So if you have particular ideas that you would like put in the mix, I know there are various channels for for doing so, because there's very broad representation of various interested groups on the 900th committee, but do get in touch. There should be a link on our website that we set up some time ago, and many of you have already contributed your ideas, but do simply drop us a line to get your ideas in the mix as well. Obviously, a number of those are based on people's experience of the 850th. So many will have remembered the William Harvey Revolutionary Circus, the great drama production that was put on in West Smithfield in the front of the hospital, the Bartholomew Fair, the Smithfield Ball, the Guildhall Dinner, all these events. But I'm sure in the 21st century, there's scope for some really innovative new ideas.
For those who are looking for inspiration, there's a wonderful thing on YouTube. It's, I think, the private video, cine in those days, that Mr. Lettin, the orthopedic surgeon, made himself, and it covers so many of the events. It's only 15 minutes long, well worth looking at to remind yourself if you want any ideas about what happened 48 years ago.
So thanks for the plug, Ed. Yes, Will Palin and I went out to see Alan Lettin last summer at his home in Suffolk. Unfortunately, he's not connected to the World Wide Web, so he won't be able to join us tonight. But yes, he produced that marvelous home movie, and it is indeed the most popular video on our YouTube site. So the link is in the eShot. And well worth a look, or even a second look, just to remind yourself about some of the exciting things that happened then. But you were mentioning, Ed, that these were times of change, and this was at a point coinciding, I think, after you'd completed your SHO rotation, and you yourself started to move away to undertake your postgraduate training.
Yes, I did my house jobs elsewhere, in Cambridge and Reading, and then came back to Barts. So I've only worked prior to 2015 at Barts for 6 months in 1975. So I left to go to Hammersmith and Royal Postgraduate Medical School, and then was appointed at the National Heart and the Brompton, and then I moved to St George's, partly I think because the Brompton weren't willing to invest in what I regarded as a very important part of cardiology, which was rhythm management and control of heart rhythm abnormalities. And I spent much of my time, my working life at St George's. And I did something that's a bit unusual, interestingly. I moved in my late 50s to the Heart Hospital. And I have to say, I think that was, for me, something that was very, it re-energized, very re-energizing. And maybe it's something actually a lot of people will do, certainly in our day, and when we were students and young doctors, moving as a consultant was almost seen as you didn't do that. You know, you saw out your time. And I absolutely understand that, because you feel responsible for the patients. You were the doctor for the patient. You were the advocate of the patient, and that was a lifelong commitment. And so you can see the sort of paradox of changing, jumping to another trust as a consultant. But for me, it was something that was it regenerated. I felt as if I'd taken on a second youth almost. And by coincidence, I was asked to be medical director of the Heart Hospital at a time when I had been asked to be involved in redefining cardiology in London, because we were aware that a place like London, a large, enormous city, very wealthy city, should have standards of care across the patch that were second to none. And we looked at cardiology, cardiovascular care in London, and really there were very few outstanding world-class exemplars of care. And that was for me, a very important part. I'd written some of the national service framework documents for national delivery of arrhythmia care in the UK. And this was an opportunity to sort of put some flesh on those bones. And so when St. Bartholomew's had made a decision that as a result of what had happened in the 80s and 90s, that they needed to invest, Barts was saved, to which we will be ever grateful to the Save Barts campaign. That when Barts Health, as it had become, or it was the Royal London and Barts at the time, had decided to invest in St. Bartholomew's Hospital, for me, and that decision that they were going to invest and potentially produce a cardiac unit, it was too good an opportunity. So, as I think you have had explained before, the decision was arranged that the Hospital of St. Bartholomew's would develop a major cardiovascular centre. And of course, it was out of merging three centres, the London Chest and the residue of cardiovascular care at St. Bartholomew's, which had been reduced because most of it had been transferred to the London Chest, with the Heart Hospital, which was part of UCLH. And that opportunity was too good to miss. So I and Charles Knight formed the group that really developed the Barts Heart Centre. And really that was the start of my coming back to my alma mater to deliver what is now one of the biggest cardiovascular units in the world.
Now, of course, the Barts you came back to in this way had changed radically during the previous 20 years, because one of the things that we haven't yet mentioned was the amalgamation of Barts Medical College with that of the London, which happened in the early 90s. Tell me a little bit about that and the difference it made to the nature of the medical student's life, which persists up to this day.
Well, I think what it does is to move the Queen Mary's University of London became the home, if you like, for Barts and the Royal London Medical Colleges, and that was a decision that I understand was purposefully made to bring medical school in education fully under the university umbrella. And I think everybody understands that. Is it the right thing to do? Somebody else will have to answer that question, not me. I suppose I find it, I do find that it takes medical students away from some aspects of the life of the hospital, but then so does the change in society. We don't live as junior doctors, we don't have junior doctors living in the hospital in the same way. They are sometimes resident on call, but the shift work patterns that most of them do nowadays doesn't allow the kind of life that probably you and I led as junior doctors. The one thing that I would say about the medical students and the junior doctors nowadays, I am just full of complete admiration for what they have to do, what they have to learn, and their ability to perform. The ones we have at this hospital are just the most outstanding group of junior doctors I've ever come across. They are spectacularly good, without exception, I have to say. And I think for me, that is hugely supportive. It is inspiring for the next generation. They are the future. They are the people, Robert, who are going to look after you and I as we get into our old age. And I'm just so impressed with their qualities. They live a very, very different life, but that's the way things have changed, both as nurses, both doctors. It's a very different life. And given what has happened to healthcare over the last 50 years, it's probably exactly the right thing. There are lots of things we have to learn, lots of things we have to improve. I come back to what I learned when we were looking at healthcare in London. And to me, Jeremy Hunter was right when he said not so many years ago that there was, when hospital inspections occurred in London, there weren't very many that scored very, very highly. And you can argue about the whole inspection framework and whether it's the right thing to do, but it gives you an opportunity when you get inspected. It gives you an opportunity to look at yourself very harshly in a light. And the merger was really inspiring from that perspective. It gave us the opportunity to define what is outstanding care, bringing three groups of hospitals, all relatively small, lung, chest, the Barts and the Heart Hospital together, was a very inspiring journey. And it is the reason why I think we've achieved so much in the last 5 years. And I'm just so pleased that it's been on the frame of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. It's given me enormous pleasure. I don't want to give the impression at all that that St. Bartholomew's is all cardiac. I'm a cardiologist, but I've had to learn in the last 5 years far more about oncology, Robert, than I ever should have had to learn. And I'm full of admiration for the oncology and cancer unit. So a very significant part of St. Bartholomew's Hospital is the Barts Cancer Centre. You and I...
We're looking at the square as it now is, and of course to the untrained eye, the facades look pretty much the same as they have done since, well, the picture that you showed us earlier of the cars parked in the square.
Yeah, so if I could drive an ambulance, that would be my car over there. It's got 2 extra floors on the top, and the top floor is the Barts Cancer Centre chemotherapy day unit, and that regularly sees 150 to 170 patients a day, for instance. So we have a very large cancer centre, formed in many ways from when we were medical students. Sir Ronald Bodley Scott was really one of the forefathers of oncology practice in this country. And the staff that he trained went out to essentially be the backbone of the Marsden, the Christie, and to an extent UCLH. And they persevered through those difficult days in the 80s and 90s, and we owe a huge debt of gratitude to them for what they've done. But we have now world-leading Barts Cancer Centres. We have just recently, for instance, papers in Nature, papers in the New England Journal on drug development, novel drug developments for cancer, biomarkers for cancer recognition. We are in, as you know, the heritage, very central to the formation of the plans around a breast cancer unit. We have a leading people in the Barts lung cancer, and we have ambitions to be a significant lung cancer department. The thread of hematology, oncological care has continued since those days in the 70s. So this is a significant part of this hospital. And it's important not to forget about the endocrine department and the respiratory and cystic fibrosis departments, which are significant parts. So what is St. Bartholomew's Hospital nowadays? It is the specialist part of a much bigger footprint. But firstly, Barts Health, but also part of what we call now the new integrated care system, which is essentially bringing together all aspects of care in northeast London. And the Barts is absolutely at the center of that specialist care. That is what has changed. When you have somebody who has mitral valve disease, you need an operation by somebody who is highly experienced, but not one person. You need a whole team that are able to offer 24-hour, 7-day-a-week care for patients with a mitral valve problem, and extend that to all of those specialisms that we offer in the hospital. And that's what we built here.
Well, we're looking at the atrium within the new KGV building, and this is one of the sights that blows away people who haven't been to Barts for many a long year, because this site is totally unfamiliar to them, as is, of course, the new main entrance on Little Britain, because the Henry VIII gate is no longer the main entrance to the hospital. This is the main entrance, and that's why there are all these TV cameras situated around, because this was the occasion when His Royal Highness Prince Philip was admitted to Barts just a few months ago. But we spoke, didn't we, about the buildings that no longer exist. And here's a site that will be familiar to our nursing colleagues, or will it? Because this is the site of the old Queen Mary nursing home. And there will be those watching tonight who can tell of the views of St. Paul's that they enjoyed from the rooftop where they were sunbathing in the old days. I don't suppose for one moment you're allowed on the roof this time, are you, Ed?
I've not been up that far into that. I think there is a way up there. There actually is one part of the roof you can get to with a bit of ingenuity, but that's not there. They're wonderful premises. That atrium is just awe-inspiring, isn't it? It's the site of where you entered through past the flower shop and had the surgical block on your right and the medical block on your left. But it's a wonderful space, and the facilities are really second to none. So we're hugely grateful to Barts Health for the investments that they've made in providing these fabulous facilities.
One of the other buildings that we spoke of earlier is, of course, Gloucester House, and that has been changed out of all recognition. And there's now a modern office block on that site, which is occupied by a number of different companies. But the good news is that the management of that building want to engage with the hospital in some tangible way. They recognize that that was the site of a nurse's home many years ago. And I know that they are in active discussion with the League of Nurses about putting a commemorative plaque within the reception area of that building. Now, of course, one of the big changes that has happened over the years in terms of the personnel addresses the equality and the diversity issues. So I'm putting up a picture now of several members of the current nursing staff. Tell us more about this, Ed, because this is a fantastic aspect in a very positive sense about what has happened in this century, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think you and I were talking about whether we could remember any, for instance, were there any female consultants at St. Bartholomew's in our day?
There were anaesthetists and there were radiologists.
Yeah.
And pathologists, yes, but I can't remember any consultant physicians or surgeons on the general side.
I think one of the things that Barts Health has been is actually leading. Our chief executive, Dame Orwin Williams, has been absolutely at the forefront of an equality and diversity agenda. And I think the thing that struck me over the years is I've worked with many female cardiologists. Without question, all of them have been wonderful people to work with. But I've always been impressed at the way in which they've had to fight sometimes against a lot of us men who have not necessarily been the easiest of colleagues. life is still difficult in some ways, and we are doing our utmost. And one of the things I'm very proud of personally is the way we went out of our way to make my area of cardiology a very attractive one for female cardiologists. So from many aspects, I think the life has changed. Equality is absolutely central. We have to use all our workforce to their utmost and give them all the opportunities that you can do for advancement. This is some of our staff from the cath labs at St Bartholomew's. Is the uniform importantly different? Well, one of the things that I've always been trying to get my medical colleagues to understand is that nurses regard infection control as being absolutely central to what they do, and all doctors need to do the same thing. So here's to everybody looking the same, but doing their different jobs and allowed to do their different jobs to their utmost.
Well, our last picture shows some recent Barts London graduates, and we've sort of come full circle because although the medical schools have amalgamated some 25 years ago, special dispensation has been granted at the request of the students that their academic gowns, when they graduate, should feature none other than the familiar Barts coat of arms. And the so-called rites of passage that they go through upon graduation is very highly regarded, more so than the official graduation ceremony, which takes place in a somewhat anonymous background.
Long may the insignia and shield of William Wakering continue, sorry, John Wakering, I do beg his pardon, continue to be an insignia of what St Bartholomew's Hospital is all about. It's about excellence. It's about moving with the times. You know, we have a very long history, and some people think, well, is there a conservatism born of that fact that you are so old? I'd like to think that we use the lessons of the past, we've learned from them, and we've moved St Bartholomew's Hospital into the 21st century, and it is a beacon of outstanding care. Cancer, cardiac, respiratory, fertility, endocrine. And long may it continue for another many, many hundreds of years.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. I tell you what, let me ask you just one question before we close. It's been a fascinating time, and I know that our viewers are going to have valued all the perspectives that you've been able to offer over the last 50 years as part of the broader history of Barts. Now, if we go back to the consultants that we knew during our training, be it Eddie Tuckwell or any of the other names that were familiar to us from those years gone by, surely that there will have been some changes that we're witnessing now that will have surprised them, and some that will have absolutely delighted them. Would you like to pick out one or two that we may not yet have spoken of that you can think of in that context?
I suppose delighted, given some of the aspects of what I took from reminding myself of what was written in 1974 in the book about the 850th. I think what would delighted them would be that St Bartholomew's has not disappeared and has prospered. That's the first thing. Surprised? I think they would be very surprised by the fact that we could treat so many patients in such a much smaller bed base than happened then. Remember, what were the 600, nearly 700 beds back in those days? And now we have just over 300, I'll argue somewhere 300 to 350 beds. But that's the nature of the disease, of the diseases and the treatments that we have. I'd like to think that they would recognize that we have addressed, at least in part, some of the inequities. One of the things that I found when I was doing a lot of the work about cardiovascular care in London was that there was, if you had a rhythm problem, for instance, a slow heart rate and needed a pacemaker, there was 3 times difference the chance that you would have a pacemaker between the poorest and the most wealthy part of London. That, you know, it was a terrible thing that we had sat on that for several years and haven't done much about it. And one of the great things that I think we've been able to contribute to is that we've addressed, in part, absolutely no way we have solved the majority, but we've addressed about the inequities of healthcare. So there are surprises, there are things that we should be proud of, there are delights. I think you're probably right, they'd be very surprised about the uniforms nowadays, probably saying that they look so much smarter in those days. But I think one day, following me around the hospital, I'd convince them that we've done the right thing and that, for instance, it's a different world, so much is very different. And I think they would be proud, delighted and enormously pleased about what has happened to St Bartholomew's in another 50 of its 900 years. Robert, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me again. It's been an enormous pleasure.
A few things I need to mention before we close, Ed. We, from the Barts Heritage side, are going to take a short summer break. It's been a fascinating series of events that we've been running right through the last 12 months, but we're going to be reconvening in September with a brand new program. And as I've promised you on repeated occasions, we're looking forward to a so-called hybrid nature of event where we're going to be running live meetings in the Great Hall, as well as putting recordings up on our YouTube channel. You'll shortly be getting news of our brand new membership scheme. I'm sorry it's taken a while to put these things together, but like all these things that appear so simple on the surface, it really has been quite complex, and it's taken us time to work through that, but we hope to bring you news of that in the very near future, the ways in which you can sign up to that. And it will only be our paid up members who will receive the invitations to the live events in the Great Hall. So as I say, a short break now. You'll still get monthly emails telling you about our future events and about the events that are being put on by our partners, including City Music Foundation, Charterhouse, etc. And so until then, thank you very much. Thank you, Ed, and a very good evening to you all. Bye-bye now.